So, Marcus Coates, you've just spent the best part of 2 days performing the role of Marcus Gordon in The Directors. And as you're kind of decompressing and coming out of that experience, what are your immediate feelings?
Firstly, exhaustion. It was incredibly tiring. But you said performing. I didn't really feel like I was performing. I felt like I was taking instruction from Marcus, the director, just desperately trying to understand what he was going through at the time that he did go through this. And that was really my main motivation when I was talking to him, just to try and find some way of relating to it, however difficult that was.
I mean, I suppose I used the word performing because we're in a theatre and you were on a stage. And I'm wondering where you think the metaphor or kind of symbol of the theatre comes from in Marcus's unconscious.
Well, it really came through our conversations. This is all about his experience when he was on a bus. And the feeling for him was one of, he felt like he was being interrogated. He felt very remote and alone and vulnerable. And that everybody was watching him, judging him, and the embarrassment and the shame was overwhelming. Some of the emotions he was asking me to inhabit, I didn't want to start acting those. And I knew I didn't want to pretend to inhabit them. But when some of those messages were coming at me from the whispering, the idea that I smelt, the idea that I was disgusting, and you just hear it and hear it and hear it over and over and over again. Although I know in this context, they're not really meaning it, it starts to sink in and it starts to, there's some residue left over in you, and it did start to affect me. And along with all the other stuff that was happening to me that was forced upon me, I felt very out of control. I felt very passive in a not a pleasant way, very vulnerable. And yeah, that made me quite emotional. And
so you were constantly taunted by the refrains, taunted by the assistants passing you meat and heating you up and wetting you, taunted by the audience in the theatre. So there was this kind of sort of complete surround sound of taunting, which finally does get to you. And I was wondering whether you were conscious of Marcus Gordon directing it from the auditorium and what he felt about hearing those accusations, if you like.
Particularly the whispering, because those are the words he heard people say about him. Or he was having an auditory hallucination that people were saying things about him or whispering about him. And he could hear it very closely in his ear. So for him to relive that, I was very concerned about that, actually. And I thought, this is bad for me. This must be really awful for him to sit through this again. So yeah, I was very concerned for him then.
But when you finished that section, you got off the stage and you went to him and talked to him and asked him how he felt about it. What did you talk about?
At each stage I came off and I wanted to see if that was okay for him. Was that an authentic experience? Do we need to do that again? How was that for him? Because he's the final arbiter, really, of whether this is his experience or not.
Absolutely. And I mean, he wasn't really sort of actively involved today in the way that he was yesterday when you and he were in a kind of dialogue which was very fluent. I mean, it was improvised, but he came back at you with a kind of answer for everything. Were you worried about him yesterday?
No, not at all, actually. When we were filming the sequences where we were having the very direct conversations, Marcus, the director, his level of expertise in knowing his own mind was so assured as we all kind of know our own minds, I felt like I was in capable hands there. Whatever I came up with, he had an answer for. And I think these are the conversations that were going through his mind at the time. This is the attempt to rationalize these experiences, where rationalization doesn't help doesn't help at all. It's just a useless tool. There's no way of soothing yourself. There's no way of making it okay. And for me, who's never had this experience, I was just going down every avenue I could in my own mind of how I could come out of this, how I could stop this happening. And each time he just rebutted that and said, no, that won't work, that won't work. There was nowhere to go. It was like being in a horrible maze. And that panic actually felt quite real
I think
for
it
me.
was that moment when he was sort of projecting some of his panic, anxiety, numbness into you, because he's such an authority and an expert, and in that dialogue between you, which I kept thinking this is a very different dialogue to a psychoanalyst and a patient, or a psychiatrist and a patient. There were two minds who were exchanging thoughts with kind of equality, but he was empowered in that exchange, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's that last scene when there is really nothing. I mean, that felt literally impossible to understand. And I knew I couldn't really get near that. That sort of vacantness, that emptiness, where there's no brain activity, there's literally nothing. And the only thing I could slightly get close to was the fear of this never ending and never coming out of that. And I could touch that, I think.
Well, particularly because you were both asking each other one question. There was a refrain where I can't remember who began it. I think it was Marcus Gordon. He said, "What's going on?" And you answered by saying, "What is going on?" And this question came back and forth. That sort of reductive sound of the question represented a void, really, which, did you feel that you were in that void?
Yeah, I felt like that sentence didn't have any meaning at all. It wasn't a question. Those words didn't have any meaning. I think if you say something over and over again, it loses its meaning. I think that's kind of what happened there. I think in a way I was saying it in a way to sort of perhaps prove to myself that I was still there in that darkness, even though I knew this is a stage and this is a theatre and we're being filmed. Because I hear the director Marcus's voice in my ear so clearly. It's very, very intimate. It's almost like he is my thought. So everything else disappears. So I'm just with that. I'm just with him. So yeah, that feels very intimate but very exposed. It was a very strange sensation.
That point was exactly the point that Marcus felt very emotional and felt a feeling that he hadn't felt for years, which had been kind of, I suppose, defended against by numbness, the numbness which meant sure he couldn't feel anything. But I think that was the moment for him in the last 2 days that he really felt a connection with his own feelings through putting you in a place of nothingness.
It's very hard for me to imagine, or for me to get into someone else's experience, but it's also, thinking about it now, it's very hard to think about what it would be like for someone to see their own experiences being enacted in that intimate way, in that exposing way as well. It's like watching your memory or your life being played out in front of you. Mm. He was the director and the writer of this, really.
Yeah.
And my responsibility was really just to stage it.
What is particularly interesting about the situation here in the context of a film, a theatre, which is the setting for the film, is it's so different from a clinical setting where the patient is always being judged and pathologized. It feels that this particular kind of environment that we've created is not judgmental. It actually explores something in a very different way. I mean, can you describe the difference?
I mean, I don't know if judgmental is the right word, but I think definitely in my experience of spending time in the clinic in London, the narrative was there, and the purpose of the conversation between the patient and the clinician, the psychiatrist, was about assessment. So the psychiatrist was making judgments about the narrative in terms of how to medicate that condition. And I think what's interesting about this, and I found all my conversations with the people, the directors, is that the conversations have been about experience for the sake of experience. There's no assessment of it. There's no analysing the experience. We've just said, this is human experience. This is, not that we're celebrating it, but this needs to be known. This is the breadth of human experience. And that feels like something that we can all learn from, I think. And that's something we all need to know about.